Free my dad and I'll heal you, poor girl tells Paralyzed judge. What she did next shocked her. When 16-year-old Maya's father faced life in prison, she made an impossible offer to the Paralyzed judge. Free my dad and I'll heal your legs. What happened next defied everything anyone believed about justice, miracles, and the power of desperate love. Before we continue this wonderful story, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Now let's get to where the story began. The courtroom in the Riverside County Superior Court felt like a place where hope came to die, its oak-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere of institutional indifference that had processed thousands of cases without regard for the human lives being decided by procedures that prioritized legal technicalities over actual justice. On this gray Monday morning in November, 16-year-old Maya Rodriguez sat in the front row behind the defendant's table, watching her father face accusations that would destroy their family if the legal system failed to recognize what everyone who knew him understood: that Miguel Rodriguez was incapable of the violence he'd been charged with committing. "Your Honor," said District Attorney Patricia Vance, addressing the bench where Judge William Harrison presided over proceedings from his wheelchair with the bitter efficiency of someone whose own suffering had eliminated any belief in fairness or mercy. "The state will prove that the defendant Miguel Rodriguez committed armed robbery resulting in serious bodily harm to the victim, crimes that warrant the maximum sentence of 25 years to life under California's three-strikes law." Maya felt her stomach clench at words that would condemn her father to dying in prison for crimes she knew he'd never committed, understanding that their family's poverty had prevented them from hiring legal representation capable of challenging evidence that seemed overwhelming despite being fabricated by people whose wealth could purchase false testimony and manipulated forensics. "Ms. Chun," Judge Harrison said, addressing Maya's father's overworked public defender whose caseload made thorough investigation impossible, "is the defense ready to proceed with opening statements?" "Yes, Your Honor," replied Susan Chun, consulting notes that reflected her best efforts to provide adequate representation despite systemic limitations that made effective defense nearly impossible for defendants who couldn't afford private attorneys with resources necessary for challenging prosecutorial evidence through independent investigation. Maya looked at her father sitting at the defendant's table with quiet dignity that had sustained their family through years of economic struggle, noting how his calloused hands, evidence of decades spent in honest labor, were now shackled as if he represented danger to a society that had failed to provide economic opportunities that might have prevented the desperation that led other people to commit crimes he'd been falsely accused of perpetrating. At 52, Miguel Rodriguez had worked construction, landscaping, and restaurant kitchens to support his family since Maya's mother had died 8 years earlier, leaving him to raise 3 children alone while managing grief that had never interfered with his commitment to providing stability through love and determination, rather than bitterness about circumstances that might have justified anger, but had only strengthened his resolve to model resilience for his children. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Dave Vance began, presenting the state's case with prosecutorial confidence that came from winning similar cases through superior resources and investigative capabilities that defense attorneys couldn't match. "The evidence will show that on the evening of October 15th, Miguel Rodriguez entered Martinez Grocery armed with a knife, demanded money from elderly owner Rosa Martinez, and attacked her when she attempted to activate the store's silent alarm system. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the cash register and the weapon used in the attack. Security footage shows someone matching his physical description leaving the scene. Mrs. Martinez identified him from a police lineup. The evidence is overwhelming and indisputable." Maya knew that every piece of evidence DA Vance described had been manufactured through corruption that her family couldn't afford to expose through private investigators and expert witnesses who might reveal how fingerprints could be planted, security footage could be manipulated, and victim identification could be influenced through prosecutorial coaching designed to secure convictions rather than discover truth. Mr. Rodriguez was arrested at his home with cash matching the amount stolen from Martinez Grocery, providing additional evidence of his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Maya remembered the night police had planted money in their apartment while her father was at work, creating evidence that would be impossible to challenge through legal procedures that assumed police integrity rather than investigating law enforcement corruption that affected cases where defendants lacked resources for independent verification of official claims. The state asks you to hold Mr. Rodriguez accountable for crimes that have devastated an innocent elderly victim while terrorizing our community through violence that demands justice through maximum legal consequences. As DA Vance concluded opening statements that painted Miguel Rodriguez as a dangerous criminal deserving life imprisonment, Maya felt rage building alongside desperation. Not just anger about false accusations, but fury at a legal system that allowed wealth to purchase justice while condemning innocent poor people through procedures that served prosecutorial statistics rather than actual truth. Ms. Chun, Judge Harrison said with the weary impatience of someone whose paralysis had been accompanied by cynicism that made him view all defendants as probably guilty regardless of evidence quality, present your opening statement. Thank you, Your Honor, Susan Chun replied, consulting notes that reflected her sincere efforts to provide effective representation despite resource limitations that made challenging prosecutorial evidence extremely difficult. Ladies and gentlemen, Miguel Rodriguez is an innocent man whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mr. Rodriguez was working late at Santiago's restaurant on the night in question, as employment records and witness testimony will demonstrate. The evidence against him has been manufactured through investigative errors and prosecutorial overzealousness that has targeted an innocent hard-working father. The fingerprints could have been planted, the security footage is too unclear for reliable identification, and Mrs. Martinez's identification occurred under circumstances that compromise reliability. The cash found in Mr. Rodriguez's home represents his legitimate earnings rather than stolen money. Maya appreciated Ms. Chen's efforts to present alternative explanations for evidence against her father, but she could see from jury expressions that reasonable doubt was difficult to establish when prosecutorial resources had created seemingly comprehensive case the defense couldn't effectively challenge through independent investigation that required money their family didn't possess. Mr. Rodriguez has no criminal history, no history of violence, and no motive for committing crimes that contradict everything his family, employers, and community members know about his character. The state's case is built on circumstantial evidence that creates appearance of guilt without proving actual guilt. I ask you to examine the evidence carefully and recognize that convicting an innocent man serves neither justice nor community safety when the real perpetrator remains free to commit additional crimes while Mr. Rodriguez pays for someone else's actions. As opening statements concluded with clear advantage to prosecution, whose resources had created case that would be difficult to overcome through reasonable doubt that required expensive investigation and expert testimony, Maya felt familiar helplessness that came from watching injustice unfold through legal procedures that claimed to serve fairness while actually serving wealth and political interests that prioritized conviction statistics over actual guilt or innocence. Judge Harrison observed proceedings from his wheelchair with expression that suggested someone whose personal suffering had eliminated belief in fairness or mercy, whose paralysis from a drunk driving accident had created bitterness that made him view defendants as deserving punishment regardless of evidence quality, whose disability had taught him that life was fundamentally unjust and that legal proceedings should reflect that reality through harsh sentences that matched life's cruelty. At 63, Judge Harrison had been paralyzed from the waist down for 12 years, ever since a teenage drunk driver had ended his ability to walk while apparently ending his capacity for compassion that might interfere with efficient case processing that cleared court calendars rather than serving individual justice for defendants whose circumstances rarely interested him beyond their relevance to legal technicalities. Court will recess for lunch, Judge Harrison announced with mechanical efficiency that treated Maya's father's life as administrative matter rather than human crisis. We'll resume at 2 p.m. with presentation of state's evidence. As court personnel and spectators filed out for lunch break that would be followed by testimony designed to convict her innocent father through manufactured evidence she couldn't afford to challenge, Maya remained in her seat while processing desperation that was approaching the breaking point where conventional solutions seemed inadequate for circumstances that required intervention beyond what human institutions could provide. Maya, said her older brother Carlos, settling beside her with a protective concern that had sustained their family since their mother's death. Ms. Chun says the state's evidence will be harder to challenge than she initially hoped, but she's still fighting for Dad. Carlos, fighting isn't enough when the system is designed to convict innocent poor people while protecting wealthy criminals who can afford to purchase false testimony and manipulated evidence. Maya, what else can we do besides supporting Ms. Chen's legal defense and hoping the jury recognizes Dad's innocence? Carlos, I don't know what else we can do through normal legal procedures, But I know Dad is innocent, and I know this court is about to convict him for crimes he didn't commit unless something changes the judge's understanding of justice versus legal technicalities. Maya, judges follow legal procedures rather than personal understanding of justice or individual circumstances. Carlos, maybe some judges could be persuaded to follow justice if they understood that mercy serves community welfare better than harsh sentences that destroy innocent families while failing to address actual crime or criminal rehabilitation. Carlos looked at his younger sister with concern about emotional stress that was making her talk about persuading judges through methods that sounded more like fantasy than realistic legal strategy, understanding that desperation was affecting her judgment about what interventions were possible within legal systems that operated according to established procedures rather than individual appeals for mercy. Maya, what are you thinking about that sounds like more than just hoping Judge Harrison will recognize Dad's innocence? Carlos, I'm thinking about the fact that Judge Harrison's paralysis might affect his ability to understand mercy and justice when his own suffering hasn't been healed through forgiveness or hope that circumstances can change through intervention that seems impossible, but might be available to people who believe in possibilities beyond what human institutions can provide. Maya, you're talking about Judge Harrison's paralysis like it's connected to Dad's case in ways that don't make legal sense. Carlos, I'm talking about Judge Harrison's paralysis like it's connected to his inability to believe in justice and mercy that might serve community welfare better than harsh sentences based on manufactured evidence that destroys innocent families. Maya, even if that connection made sense, there's nothing we can do about Judge Harrison's paralysis or his attitudes about sentencing that would affect Dad's case. Maya looked at her brother with expression that carried certainty about possibilities he couldn't understand, recognizing that desperation had brought her to the edge of revealing abilities she'd kept hidden since childhood, abilities that might be able to heal more than just physical injuries if used for purposes that served justice rather than just personal advantage. Carlos, she said quietly, what if there was something I could do about Judge Harrison's paralysis that might affect his understanding of mercy and justice in ways that could help Dad? Maya, what are you talking about? Carlos, what if I could heal Judge Harrison's legs in exchange for Dad's freedom? The question hung in the courthouse corridor like a bridge between desperation and hope, between human limitations and divine possibilities, between accepting injustice and believing that love could create miracles when circumstances required intervention beyond what legal systems could provide through procedures designed to serve institutional efficiency rather than individual truth or family welfare. Neither brother understood yet that Maya possessed abilities that could indeed heal paralysis, or that her desperate love for their father was about to transform a corrupt legal proceeding into something that would challenge everyone's understanding of justice, mercy, and the power of faith to create miracles when conventional solutions were inadequate for circumstances that required divine intervention through human vessels chosen for purposes beyond what earthly institutions could achieve. Through wealth and political influence alone. The moment that would shatter everyone's understanding of what was possible came at exactly 2:47 p.m. during the prosecution's presentation of evidence, when Maya Rodriguez stood up in the gallery and interrupted District Attorney Vance's testimony about her father's supposed guilt with words that would transform a routine criminal proceeding into something that defied every assumption about justice, miracles, and the power of desperate love. Your Honor, Maya said, her clear voice carrying across the hushed courtroom with authority that seemed impossible from a 16-year-old girl whose family's poverty had rendered them powerless against institutional corruption. I need to address the court about evidence that will prove my father's innocence. Young lady, Judge Harrison replied with the irritated efficiency he used to maintain courtroom order while processing cases as quickly as possible, this is not the appropriate time or procedure for spectator comments. Please sit down or you'll be held in contempt. Your Honor, what I have to say will change everything about this case if you're willing to listen to evidence that goes beyond what the prosecution has presented. Miss, I don't know who you are, but courtroom proceedings follow established legal protocols rather than interruptions from family members who disagree with evidence against defendants. Your Honor, Maya continued, stepping forward with determination that made court security uncertain whether to restrain her or allow Judge Harrison to handle the disruption through normal contempt procedures. I'm Maya Rodriguez, Miguel Rodriguez's daughter, and I'm offering to provide proof of his innocence in exchange for something that serves both justice and your personal welfare. Miss Rodriguez, proof of your father's innocence should be presented through his defense attorney using proper legal channels, rather than dramatic interruptions that serve emotional purposes rather than legal objectives. Your Honor, What I'm offering goes beyond legal procedures to address justice that legal procedures have failed to provide when corruption makes conventional defense impossible for families who can't afford to purchase truth through expensive investigation and expert testimony. Judge Harrison felt familiar annoyance with family members who believed emotional appeals could overcome legal evidence, though something about Maya's composure and certainty was making him curious about what she thought she could offer that professional attorneys hadn't already considered. Miss Rodriguez, you have 30 seconds to explain what you think you can provide that changes established evidence against your father, after which you'll be removed from this courtroom for disrupting legal proceedings. Your Honor, Maya said, moving closer to the bench where Judge Harrison presided from his wheelchair with bitter efficiency that reflected years of processing cases without regard for individual circumstances that couldn't be addressed through legal technicalities. I can heal your paralysis if you'll dismiss all charges against my father and declare his innocence. The offer hit the courtroom like physical force that eliminated all sound except the hum of fluorescent lights and the whisper of air conditioning, creating silence so complete that everyone present could hear their own heartbeats while processing words that challenged everything they understood about legal procedures, medical possibilities, and the relationship between human institutions and divine intervention. Miss Rodriguez, Judge Harrison said with voice that carried disbelief mixed with something that might have been desperate hope quickly suppressed by years of accepting that miracles didn't happen to people whose suffering had taught them that life was fundamentally cruel and unfair. That statement suggests either mental illness or deliberate contempt for legal proceedings through claims that are medically impossible. Your Honor, my statement suggests that some forms of justice require intervention beyond what human institutions can provide when those institutions serve wealth and corruption rather than truth and mercy. Miss Rodriguez, healing paralysis is medically impossible, and legal decisions are based on evidence rather than supernatural claims that have no basis in reality. Your Honor, what if I could prove that supernatural intervention is possible by demonstrating healing abilities that would restore your capacity to walk in exchange for your capacity to recognize justice that serves truth rather than just prosecutorial statistics? District Attorney Vance rose from her table with professional outrage designed to restore normal legal proceedings that served her conviction goals rather than allowing disruptions that might interfere with case she'd built through manufactured evidence. Your Honor, this disruption has gone far enough. The defendant's daughter is clearly attempting to interfere with legal proceedings through delusional claims that waste court time while insulting the intelligence of everyone present. Your Honor, Maya replied before Judge Harrison could respond, Dave Vance's objection proves that she's more concerned about securing conviction than discovering whether divine intervention might reveal truth that prosecutorial resources have been used to conceal rather than investigate. Miss Rodriguez, divine intervention is not admissible evidence in legal proceedings that operate according to established law rather than religious beliefs or supernatural claims. Your Honor, established law that serves corruption rather than justice might need to be challenged by divine intervention when human institutions fail to protect innocent people from wealth-based persecution that destroys families through manufactured evidence. Judge Harrison felt internal conflict between professional obligation to maintain courtroom order and personal curiosity about Maya's confidence that seemed unshakable despite obvious impossibility of her claims, wondering what could make a 16-year-old girl believe she possessed abilities that medical science insisted were fictional. Miss Rodriguez, assuming for the sake of argument that you believe you possess healing abilities, what evidence would you provide that such abilities are real rather than delusions that require psychiatric evaluation? Your Honor, I would provide evidence by healing someone's medical condition in ways that demonstrate divine power serving justice that human institutions have failed to provide through legal procedures designed to protect wealth rather than truth. Miss Rodriguez, healing someone's medical condition would require their consent and medical supervision rather than courtroom demonstrations that could cause harm through untrained medical intervention. Your Honor, healing your paralysis would require your consent and faith that divine intervention serves justice better than legal procedures that allow innocent people to be convicted through manufactured evidence that destroys families while enriching people who profit from institutional corruption. Miss Rodriguez, my paralysis is permanent spinal cord damage that cannot be reversed through any known medical intervention, much less through supernatural claims made by teenagers with no medical training. Your Honor, your paralysis might be reversible through divine intervention that serves justice when legal intervention has failed to serve truth that requires supernatural assistance to overcome human corruption that legal procedures cannot address effectively. The courtroom remained frozen in silence that reflected everyone's struggle to process conversation that had moved beyond legal territory into realm that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible when desperate love encountered institutional failure that seemed insurmountable through conventional means. Your Honor, Maya continued, I'm not asking you to accept my claims without evidence. I'm asking you to allow me to provide evidence by demonstrating healing that proves divine intervention can serve justice that legal procedures have failed to deliver. Ms. Rodriguez, demonstration of alleged healing abilities would require medical evaluation that courts are not equipped to provide or verify. Your Honor, demonstration of healing abilities would require only your willingness to allow me to touch your legs while you decide whether restored mobility affects your understanding of justice and mercy that might serve community welfare better than harsh sentences based on manufactured evidence. Ms. Rodriguez, allowing you to touch my legs would serve no legitimate legal purpose while potentially subjecting me to assault charges if your actions cause harm rather than providing impossible healing. Your Honor, allowing me to demonstrate divine healing would serve legitimate justice purposes by proving that supernatural intervention can reveal truth when human institutions serve corruption rather than protecting innocent families from wealth-based persecution. Judge Harrison felt wheels of his rational thinking grinding against possibilities that medical science insisted were impossible, but that Maya's unshakable confidence was making seem worth investigating despite obvious professional risks that accepting her offer might create. Ms. Rodriguez, what specific healing process would you use that differs from medical procedures that have failed to restore mobility that spinal cord specialists have declared permanently impossible? Your Honor, I would use divine healing that serves justice through supernatural intervention when legal procedures serve corruption rather than truth that requires divine assistance to overcome human institutions that protect wealth while destroying innocent families. Ms. Rodriguez, divine healing through supernatural intervention is not recognized by medical science or legal precedent as valid basis for courtroom procedures or sentencing decisions. Your Honor, divine healing through supernatural intervention might create new legal precedent when conventional procedures fail to serve justice that requires miraculous assistance to overcome corruption that legal systems cannot address through normal investigative or prosecutorial methods. As Maya stood before Judge Harrison's bench with unwavering confidence that seemed to emanate from source beyond her 16 years, everyone present felt atmosphere in courtroom changing in ways that suggested supernatural presence responding to desperate prayer for justice that human institutions had failed to provide. Your Honor, Maya said, I'm going to approach your wheelchair and place my hands on your legs. If you feel sensation or movement returning, you'll understand that divine intervention is offering you choice between serving corruption that destroys innocent families or serving justice that heals both physical suffering and spiritual blindness that prevents mercy. Ms. Rodriguez, approaching judicial bench without permission constitutes contempt that requires immediate arrest regardless of your claimed intentions or impossible healing abilities. Your Honor, approaching your wheelchair with healing hands constitutes divine intervention that transcends contempt charges when supernatural justice serves truth that legal procedures have failed to protect through normal investigative methods. Maya began walking toward Judge Harrison's wheelchair with calm determination that made court security uncertain about whether to physically restrain her or allow what appeared to be either breakdown or miraculous demonstration to proceed under judicial supervision. Your Honor, she said as she approached within arm's reach of his wheelchair, divine healing requires faith alongside touch. If you believe that justice should serve truth rather than corruption, and if you believe that mercy should serve community welfare rather than prosecutorial statistics, then divine intervention might provide healing that restores both your mobility and your ability to recognize innocence when legal procedures have been corrupted by wealth. Judge Harrison felt his rational mind warring with desperate hope that 12 years of paralysis had taught him to suppress, wondering whether allowing Maya to touch his legs would result in embarrassment when nothing happened or possibility that something beyond medical science might occur when desperation created circumstances where conventional limitations might be transcended through faith. Ms. Rodriguez, he said quietly, if I allow you to demonstrate your claimed abilities, and if nothing happens to change my physical condition, you'll be held in contempt and your father's trial will proceed according to legal evidence rather than supernatural intervention that has failed to occur. Your Honor, if you allow me to demonstrate divine healing, and if sensation and movement return to your legs, you'll understand that supernatural justice serves truth better than legal procedures that serve corruption, and you'll dismiss charges against my innocent father while investigating prosecutorial misconduct that manufactured evidence to convict innocent man. Ms. Rodriguez, That arrangement assumes healing that medical science declares impossible and legal outcomes that existing evidence does not support. Your Honor, that arrangement assumes divine intervention that serves justice when human institutions serve corruption that legal science refuses to acknowledge despite obvious prosecutorial misconduct that destroys innocent families through manufactured evidence. As Maya extended her hands toward Judge Harrison's paralyzed legs while everyone in the courtroom held their breath in anticipation of either miraculous healing or embarrassing failure that would end supernatural claims through obvious impossibility, the atmosphere seemed charged with supernatural presence that was about to demonstrate whether divine intervention could indeed serve justice when human institutions had failed to protect truth from wealth-based corruption that legal procedures couldn't effectively address. The emotional spark that would transform their understanding of justice, miracles, and divine intervention was about to ignite through desperate love encountering circumstances that required supernatural assistance to overcome human corruption that had rendered conventional legal defense inadequate for protecting innocent families from institutional persecution designed to serve prosecutorial advancement rather than community welfare or individual truth. The resistance to Maya's divine intervention began the moment her hands touched Judge Harrison's paralyzed legs and sensation started returning to limbs that hadn't felt anything for 12 years, when instead of embracing the miracle that should have transformed his understanding of justice and mercy, the judge's rational mind began constructing explanations that preserved his cynical worldview while rejecting supernatural possibilities that threatened the institutional authority he'd used to maintain control over circumstances he couldn't otherwise influence. "Stop," Judge Harrison said sharply, pulling his wheelchair back from Maya's touch despite the tingling sensation that was spreading through his legs for the first time since the drunk driving accident that had ended his mobility. "This courtroom will not be turned into a circus of religious fanaticism that undermines legal procedures through psychological manipulation disguised as miraculous healing." "Your Honor," Maya replied, her hand still extended toward his retreating wheelchair, "you felt sensation returning to your legs. Divine healing has begun, but it requires faith alongside touch to complete restoration that serves justice through supernatural intervention." "Miss Rodriguez, phantom sensations are common in paralysis cases and don't constitute evidence of healing that medical science has proven impossible through established neurological understanding of spinal cord damage." "Your Honor, the sensation you felt wasn't phantom pain. It was divine restoration beginning to heal damage that human medicine can't address because divine intervention serves purposes beyond medical science when justice requires supernatural assistance." District Attorney Vance rose from her table with professional urgency designed to restore normal legal proceedings before supernatural claims could interfere with conviction goals that served her career advancement rather than actual justice or community safety. "Your Honor, this disruption has exceeded all reasonable bounds. The defendant's daughter is clearly mentally unstable and requires immediate psychiatric evaluation rather than continued indulgence of delusional claims that waste court time." "Your Honor," Maya responded, Dave Vance's rush to label divine intervention as mental illness proves that prosecutorial goals include suppressing supernatural evidence that might reveal truth about manufactured evidence used to convict innocent people. "Miss Rodriguez, there is no such thing as supernatural evidence that courts can consider in legal proceedings based on verifiable facts, rather than religious beliefs or psychological disorders that create false perceptions of miraculous events. Dave Vance, there is such thing as divine intervention that reveals truth when legal procedures serve corruption rather than justice, and supernatural evidence becomes relevant when human evidence has been manufactured to serve prosecutorial statistics rather than protecting innocent families." Judge Harrison felt internal conflict between the undeniable sensation that had returned to his legs when Maya touched them and institutional pressure to maintain legal authority that required rejecting supernatural claims regardless of physical evidence that challenged medical limitations. "Miss Rodriguez, regardless of any sensations I may have experienced, legal proceedings cannot be based on claimed supernatural intervention that lacks scientific verification and contradicts established medical understanding of spinal cord injuries." "Your Honor, legal proceedings that ignore divine intervention when divine intervention provides evidence of truth serve corruption rather than justice, and supernatural healing that restores physical mobility can also restore spiritual capacity for recognizing innocence when manufactured evidence creates appearance of guilt." "Miss Rodriguez, spiritual capacity and physical healing are separate considerations that cannot influence legal decisions based on evidence, rather than religious beliefs that may comfort individuals but cannot determine guilt or innocence in criminal proceedings." Your Honor, spiritual capacity and physical healing serve the same divine purposes when institutional corruption requires supernatural intervention to protect innocent families from legal procedures that serve prosecutorial advancement rather than community welfare. Maya's public defender, Susan Chun, approached the bench with professional concern about developments that exceeded her legal training while potentially affecting her client's case in ways that could either help or harm depending on Judge Harrison's response to circumstances that no law school had prepared her to navigate. Your Honor, while I cannot comment on my client's daughter's claimed abilities, I request that any physical sensations you experience be documented by medical professionals before this trial continues, to ensure that all relevant evidence is properly evaluated. Ms. Chun, medical documentation of claimed supernatural healing would serve no legitimate legal purpose while potentially subjecting this court to ridicule that undermines judicial authority necessary for maintaining order in legal proceedings. Your Honor, medical documentation would serve legitimate purposes of ensuring that all evidence affecting judicial decision-making is properly recorded and evaluated according to established standards for verifying claims that might influence case outcomes. Ms. Chun, judicial decision-making is based on legal evidence rather than supernatural claims that cannot be verified through scientific methods that courts rely on for determining facts relevant to guilt or innocence. Maya listened to legal professionals debate documentation and verification while understanding that institutional resistance to divine intervention reflected deeper spiritual blindness that prevented recognition of supernatural justice when human institutions served corruption rather than truth. Your Honor, she said, you're fighting divine healing because accepting supernatural intervention would require acknowledging that legal institutions serve corruption rather than justice when innocent people are convicted through manufactured evidence that destroys families while enriching people who profit from institutional dysfunction. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm maintaining appropriate legal standards because accepting supernatural claims would undermine judicial authority that serves community interests through consistent application of law rather than arbitrary decisions based on religious beliefs. Your Honor, maintaining legal standards that serve corruption rather than truth undermines community interests by allowing innocent people to be destroyed through prosecutorial misconduct that legal standards refuse to acknowledge or address effectively. Ms. Rodriguez, prosecutorial misconduct is addressed through established appellate procedures rather than supernatural intervention that cannot be verified through legal standards designed to protect defendants from arbitrary judicial decisions based on personal beliefs. Your Honor, appellate procedures that take years while innocent people suffer in prison don't protect defendants from immediate injustice that requires divine intervention when legal standards serve institutional interests rather than individual truth. Judge Harrison attempted to move his legs experimentally while maintaining conversation that preserved his authority to reject supernatural evidence, discovering that movement was indeed returning despite his determination to attribute sensation to phantom pain rather than miraculous healing that would force him to reconsider everything he believed about justice, mercy, and institutional power. Ms. Rodriguez, even if some form of physical improvement were occurring, which medical science would attribute to psychological or neurological factors rather than supernatural intervention, legal decisions cannot be based on religious experiences that lack objective verification. Your Honor, physical improvement that coincides with divine intervention provides objective verification of supernatural power that serves justice when legal decisions serve corruption through manufactured evidence designed to convict innocent people. Ms. Rodriguez, correlation between claimed divine intervention and potential physical improvements doesn't constitute causation that courts can rely on for making legal decisions that affect criminal defendants and community safety. Your Honor, divine causation that heals paralysis proves supernatural intervention capable of revealing truth about manufactured evidence when human institutions refuse to investigate prosecutorial misconduct that destroys innocent families. The courtroom remained transfixed by debate that had moved far beyond normal legal territory into realm where spiritual authority was challenging institutional power through demonstration of divine intervention that threatened established hierarchies designed to serve wealth rather than justice. Your Honor, Maya continued, you can feel sensation returning to your legs because divine healing serves justice that legal healing cannot provide when human institutions protect corruption rather than truth. Ms. Rodriguez, any sensations I may experience don't change legal evidence that establishes your father's guilt regardless of your emotional attachment to his innocence or your psychological need to believe in supernatural solutions to legal problems. Your Honor, divine healing that restores your physical mobility is designed to restore your spiritual mobility for recognizing legal evidence that has been manufactured to serve prosecutorial goals, rather than revealing truth about actual innocence. Ms. Rodriguez, spiritual mobility is not relevant to legal proceedings that evaluate factual evidence rather than religious interpretations of criminal behavior or supernatural claims about prosecutorial misconduct. Your Honor, spiritual mobility becomes relevant when factual evidence has been manufactured through prosecutorial misconduct that legal procedures refuse to investigate because institutional protection serves professional interests rather than community welfare. District Attorney Vance approached the bench with documentation designed to restore normal legal proceedings through psychiatric evaluation that would eliminate supernatural claims by labeling them as mental illness requiring medical intervention rather than judicial consideration. Your Honor, I have petitioned for immediate psychiatric evaluation of the defendant's daughter, whose delusional claims about supernatural healing abilities indicate mental illness that requires professional treatment rather than courtroom indulgence. Your Honor, Maya responded, DA Vance's petition for psychiatric evaluation proves that prosecutorial resistance to divine intervention includes attempts to label supernatural evidence as mental illness when divine truth threatens manufactured evidence designed to convict innocent people. Ms. Rodriguez, psychiatric evaluation serves legitimate purposes of ensuring that courtroom disruptions are addressed through appropriate medical channels, rather than allowing mental illness to interfere with legal proceedings. DA Vance, divine intervention serves legitimate purposes of ensuring that legal proceedings serve justice, rather than allowing prosecutorial misconduct to interfere with truth that protects innocent families from institutional corruption. Judge Harrison felt his legs responding to mental commands for the first time in 12 years, while struggling to maintain judicial authority that required rejecting evidence of divine intervention despite physical proof that supernatural healing was occurring regardless of his institutional resistance. Ms. Rodriguez, regardless of any physical sensations that may be occurring, this court cannot base legal decisions on supernatural claims that lack scientific verification and contradict established medical understanding of spinal cord injuries. Your Honor, this court can base legal decisions on divine evidence that provides scientific verification of supernatural power when established medical understanding proves inadequate for circumstances that require miraculous intervention. Ms. Rodriguez, divine evidence is not recognized by legal standards that require objective verification through scientific methods, rather than subjective religious experiences that cannot be replicated or documented through established procedures. Your Honor, divine evidence provides objective verification through miraculous healing that can be documented by anyone observing restoration of mobility that medical science declared permanently impossible. As Judge Harrison continued resisting supernatural intervention while sensation and movement gradually returned to legs that had been paralyzed for 12 years, his institutional conditioning ward with undeniable physical evidence that divine healing was occurring despite his determination to attribute improvement to natural rather than supernatural causes. Ms. Rodriguez, this court will recess while I consult with medical professionals about any physical sensations that may require medical evaluation rather than supernatural interpretation. Your Honor, medical consultation will confirm divine healing that serves justice, but medical professionals will attempt to explain supernatural intervention through natural causes because institutional resistance to divine power protects corruption that benefits from prosecutorial misconduct. Ms. Rodriguez, medical consultation will provide scientific evaluation that courts rely on for determining facts rather than accepting religious interpretations that cannot be verified through established standards. Your Honor, divine healing provides scientific verification that supernatural intervention serves truth when scientific evaluation serves institutional interests, rather than recognizing miraculous evidence that reveals prosecutorial corruption. As court recessed with Judge Harrison wheeling himself toward chambers where he would struggle to understand sensation returning to paralyzed legs while resisting supernatural evidence that threatened every assumption he developed about power, justice, and institutional authority, Maya understood that divine intervention was encountering exactly the spiritual blindness that made supernatural healing necessary when human institutions served corruption rather than truth. The resistance to divine intervention reflected deeper institutional commitment to maintaining power structures that served wealth rather than justice, prosecutorial advancement rather than community welfare, legal technicalities rather than individual truth that required supernatural assistance when human procedures proved inadequate for protecting innocent families from corruption that legal standards refused to acknowledge or address effectively. But divine healing was proceeding regardless of institutional resistance, proving that supernatural intervention could serve justice even when human authority rejected miraculous evidence, creating circumstances where Judge Harrison would be forced to choose between maintaining legal power that served corruption or accepting divine authority that served truth through restoration of both physical mobility and spiritual capacity for recognizing innocence when manufactured evidence created appearance of guilt. The crisis that would force Judge Harrison to confront the full reality of divine intervention began during the emergency court session called after his medical examination revealed impossible neurological regeneration that challenged every assumption about spinal cord damage. When a power outage trapped him in the courthouse elevator with Maya for 3 hours, during which supernatural healing would complete itself while eliminating his ability to maintain institutional resistance to miraculous evidence that was transforming both his body and his understanding of justice. "Your Honor," said Dr. Patricia Singh, the neurologist whose examination had documented sensation and reflex responses in Judge Harrison's legs that medical science insisted were impossible after 12 years of complete paralysis. The test results show neurological activity that contradicts established understanding of spinal cord injury recovery patterns. The emergency session had been called at 6:30 p.m. after Dr. Singh's evaluation had revealed muscle response, sensory feedback, and nerve conduction that violated everything medical science understood about permanent spinal cord damage, creating documentation that Judge Harrison had hoped would provide rational explanation for sensations he'd been experiencing since Maya had touched his legs. "Dr. Singh," Judge Harrison replied, reviewing medical reports that showed impossible improvement rather than natural explanations that would allow him to reject supernatural intervention while maintaining judicial authority, what medical factors could account for neurological regeneration that has never been documented in cases involving complete spinal cord severance? "Your Honor, there are no known medical factors that could account for the neurological regeneration documented in your case. The improvement you're experiencing contradicts established understanding of spinal cord physiology and healing limitations." Dr. Singh, could psychological factors or placebo effects create false impressions of physical improvement that don't represent actual neurological healing? "Your Honor, the reflexes, sensation, and nerve conduction we've documented represent measurable neurological activity, rather than psychological impressions or placebo responses that wouldn't generate objective medical evidence. Judge Harrison felt his rational worldview crumbling under medical evidence that supported Maya's claims about divine intervention, while eliminating natural explanations that would preserve his skepticism about supernatural healing serving justice purposes. "Dr. Singh, what timeline would you expect for continued improvement if this neurological regeneration follows medical patterns rather than—" He paused, unwilling to say supernatural intervention, in official proceedings that might be recorded for appellate review. "Your Honor, there are no medical patterns for the type of neurological regeneration you're experiencing. Medical science has no framework for predicting outcomes when spinal cord healing violates established physiological limitations." As the emergency session concluded with medical documentation that supported supernatural healing while providing no rational explanation for impossible improvement, a severe thunderstorm knocked out power throughout the courthouse, trapping Judge Harrison and Maya in the elevator between the 4th and 5th floors during what would become 3 hours of forced proximity that eliminated all barriers between judicial authority and divine intervention. "Your Honor," Maya said as emergency lighting cast shadows in the confined elevator space where institutional formality couldn't be maintained during circumstances that required human interaction rather than legal procedure. "Divine healing is continuing whether you accept supernatural intervention or keep fighting miraculous evidence that threatens your understanding of power and authority." "Miss Rodriguez," Judge Harrison replied, though the formal address felt inappropriate in elevator confinement that had eliminated physical and psychological distance between them, medical documentation doesn't prove divine intervention, even if it documents improvement that current medical knowledge can't explain through natural processes. "Your Honor, medical documentation proves supernatural healing when medical knowledge admits that natural processes can't explain improvement that coincides with divine intervention offered for justice purposes." "Miss Rodriguez, coincidence doesn't constitute proof of causation even when timing suggests connections between claimed supernatural intervention and documented physical improvements." "Your Honor, divine causation doesn't require your intellectual acceptance to continue healing that serves justice purposes when legal institutions serve corruption rather than protecting innocent families from prosecutorial misconduct." Judge Harrison attempted to stand using elevator handrails for support, discovering that his legs were beginning to bear weight for the first time since his accident, while sensation continued returning despite his resistance to acknowledging supernatural causes for impossible improvement. Miss Rodriguez, even if some form of physical improvement is occurring through natural processes that medical science doesn't yet understand, legal decisions must be based on evidence rather than religious interpretations of medical phenomena. Your Honor, legal decisions should be based on truth rather than institutional resistance to divine evidence when natural processes prove inadequate for serving justice that protects innocent people from corruption. Miss Rodriguez, truth in legal proceedings means verifiable facts rather than religious beliefs that cannot be objectively documented through scientific methods that courts rely on for determining guilt or innocence. Your Honor, divine truth provides verifiable facts through supernatural healing that can be objectively documented by anyone observing restoration of mobility that medical science declared permanently impossible. As they remained trapped in elevator space that required conversation rather than formal legal proceedings, Judge Harrison found himself unable to maintain judicial distance from Maya while supernatural healing continued transforming his body alongside his understanding of power, authority, and the relationship between human institutions and divine justice. Miss Rodriguez, Maya, he said, using her first name for the first time while acknowledging human connection that elevator confinement was making unavoidable, help me understand what you believe is happening to my legs and why you believe it's connected to your father's case. Judge Harrison, Maya replied, also dropping formal titles that felt inappropriate during intimate conversation about supernatural intervention serving justice purposes. Divine healing is restoring your physical mobility to restore your spiritual mobility for recognizing innocence when manufactured evidence creates appearance of guilt. Maya, spiritual mobility isn't relevant to legal evaluation of criminal evidence that establishes guilt or innocence through objective analysis, rather than religious interpretation of defendant behavior. Judge Harrison, spiritual mobility becomes relevant when criminal evidence has been manufactured through prosecutorial corruption that objective analysis refuses to acknowledge because institutional protection serves professional interests rather than community welfare. Maya, prosecutorial corruption is a serious accusation that requires evidence rather than claims that supernatural intervention reveals truth that legal investigation has failed to discover through established procedures. Judge Harrison, divine intervention is providing evidence by healing your paralysis to demonstrate supernatural power that can reveal truth about manufactured evidence when legal investigation serves prosecution goals, rather than discovering actual facts. Judge Harrison felt increasing strength in his legs while elevator confinement continued eliminating his ability to escape conversation that was challenging every assumption he developed about justice, authority, and the possibility that legal institutions might serve corruption rather than truth. Maya, what specific evidence do you believe supernatural intervention can reveal about your father's case that legal investigation hasn't already considered through normal prosecutorial and defense procedures? Judge Harrison, divine revelation can expose how fingerprints were planted, security footage was manipulated, victim identification was coached, and cash was planted in our apartment to create manufactured evidence that serves DA Vance's conviction statistics rather than protecting community safety. Maya, those accusations require proof rather than supernatural claims that prosecutorial misconduct occurred despite established evidence that multiple independent sources confirm your father's guilt. Judge Harrison, supernatural proof is being provided through divine healing that demonstrates power capable of revealing truth about prosecutorial misconduct when legal proof serves institutional protection rather than exposing corruption. Maya, divine healing and prosecutorial misconduct are separate issues that cannot be connected through religious interpretation of medical improvement that coincides with legal proceedings. Judge Harrison, divine healing and prosecutorial misconduct serve the same justice purposes when supernatural intervention becomes necessary because legal institutions refuse to investigate corruption that destroys innocent families. As elevator space continued forcing intimate conversation while Judge Harrison's legs grew stronger through supernatural healing that was impossible to deny despite his institutional resistance, he began recognizing that Maya's claims about prosecutorial corruption might deserve investigation regardless of their connection to miraculous intervention. Maya, if prosecutorial misconduct occurred in your father's case, what evidence would legal investigation discover that normal defense procedures haven't already revealed through Ms. Chen's representation? Judge Harrison, legal investigation would discover financial connections between DA Vance and people who committed actual crimes, video evidence showing real perpetrators, witness testimony proving planted evidence, and documentation showing systematic corruption that serves conviction statistics rather than community safety. Maya, evidence of systematic prosecutorial corruption would require investigation resources that defendants can't afford while prosecutors control investigation procedures that serve their conviction goals. Judge Harrison, divine intervention provides investigation resources through supernatural revelation that exposes corruption when human investigation serves institutional protection rather than truth that protects innocent families. Maya, supernatural revelation cannot substitute for legal investigation that courts require for determining facts relevant to criminal guilt or innocence. Judge Harrison, supernatural revelation provides facts that legal investigation refuses to discover when human institutions serve corruption rather than justice that requires divine assistance to overcome prosecutorial misconduct. As Judge Harrison stood fully upright for the first time in 12 years while elevator emergency continued creating circumstances where supernatural healing could complete itself without institutional interference, he felt physical restoration accompanying spiritual recognition that his cynicism about justice had been shaped by personal suffering rather than objective evaluation of legal institutions. Maya, he said, I can feel strength returning to my legs in ways that medical science can't explain. But I don't understand how physical healing connects to legal decisions about criminal evidence that seems overwhelming regardless of supernatural intervention. Judge Harrison, physical healing proves divine power that can reveal truth about legal evidence when legal decisions serve corruption rather than justice that protects innocent families from prosecutorial misconduct. Maya, divine power that heals paralysis doesn't necessarily provide insight into criminal evidence that legal professionals have evaluated through established procedures designed to determine guilt or innocence. Judge Harrison, divine insight into criminal evidence becomes necessary when legal professionals serve prosecutorial goals rather than truth that requires supernatural assistance to overcome institutional corruption. Maya, what would divine insight reveal about specific evidence in your father's case that would change legal evaluation of his guilt or innocence? Judge Harrison, divine insight would reveal that every piece of evidence against my father was manufactured by people who committed actual crimes while buying prosecutorial protection through financial corruption that legal procedures refused to investigate. As supernatural healing completed restoration of Judge Harrison's mobility, while elevator emergency created circumstances where institutional resistance to divine intervention could not be maintained through formal legal procedures, both understood that forced proximity had eliminated barriers between judicial authority and supernatural justice that served truth rather than corruption. Judge Harrison took his first steps in 12 years while recognizing that divine healing was offering him choice between maintaining institutional authority that served corruption or accepting supernatural authority that served justice through protection of innocent families from prosecutorial misconduct that legal standards refused to acknowledge effectively. Maya, he said, if what you're claiming about divine intervention and prosecutorial corruption is true, then accepting supernatural healing requires me to investigate evidence that might expose systemic problems that extend far beyond your father's individual case. Judge Harrison, accepting divine healing requires investigating truth that serves community welfare rather than institutional protection when supernatural intervention provides power to expose corruption that legal institutions refuse to address through normal procedures. Maya, investigating prosecutorial corruption based on supernatural revelation would require evidence that courts can verify through established legal standards, rather than religious claims about divine insight. Judge Harrison, divine insight provides evidence that courts can verify when supernatural intervention gives people courage to testify about corruption, rather than accepting prosecutorial intimidation that serves conviction statistics. As elevator power was restored and they prepared to return to courtroom where Judge Harrison would either embrace divine healing while investigating prosecutorial corruption or continue resisting supernatural intervention despite impossible physical evidence. Both understood that forced proximity had created circumstances where institutional resistance could no longer prevent recognition that justice required divine assistance when human institutions served corruption rather than truth. The healing was complete. Judge Harrison's legs were fully restored despite medical impossibility, proving supernatural intervention that served justice purposes when legal procedures served institutional interests rather than protecting innocent families from prosecutorial misconduct designed to advance professional careers through conviction statistics that destroyed community welfare alongside individual truth. The conversation that would reveal everything happened in Judge Harrison's chambers at midnight, when the courthouse had emptied of everyone except Maya, and the man whose life had been transformed by divine healing that forced him to confront not only the corruption surrounding her father's case, but the personal tragedy that had shaped his cynical approach to justice for 12 years, since his paralysis had begun alongside his loss of faith in fairness, mercy, and the possibility that legal institutions could serve truth rather than wealth. Maya, Judge Harrison said, settling into his chair with legs that moved normally for the first time since the drunk driving accident that had ended more than just his mobility, I need to understand something about your healing abilities that goes beyond their connection to your father's case. Maya sat across from his desk in chambers where judicial decisions had been made for decades without regard for divine intervention or supernatural justice, recognizing that Judge Harrison's questions reflected spiritual awakening that accompanied physical restoration. Curiosity about divine power that had been suppressed by years of accepting that miracles didn't happen to people whose suffering had taught them to expect cruelty rather than mercy. Judge Harrison, what do you need to understand about divine healing? Maya, I need to understand how you knew that healing my paralysis would affect my ability to recognize justice, and why you believed that physical restoration would change my perspective on legal decisions that I've been making through established procedures for 23 years. Judge Harrison, divine healing reveals spiritual truth alongside physical restoration because supernatural intervention serves justice purposes when human institutions serve corruption rather than protecting innocent people from wealth-based persecution. Maya, but how did you know that my paralysis was connected to my inability to recognize innocence versus guilt when my judicial decisions have been based on legal evidence rather than personal physical condition? Maya felt recognition that Judge Harrison's questions touched deeper spiritual territory than just curiosity about healing abilities, understanding that his physical restoration was creating opportunities for emotional healing that required sharing truth about experiences that had shaped his approach to justice through personal suffering rather than objective evaluation of legal institutions. Judge Harrison, divine insight revealed that your paralysis was connected to spiritual paralysis that prevented recognition of mercy and justice when personal tragedy taught you that life was cruel and unfair rather than guided by divine love that serves truth even through suffering. Maya, what divine insight told you about my personal tragedy that connects physical paralysis to spiritual paralysis affecting judicial decisions? Judge Harrison, divine insight revealed that your physical paralysis began when someone you loved was killed by injustice that legal institutions failed to address, teaching you that justice was impossible rather than understanding that justice requires divine assistance when human institutions serve corruption. Judge Harrison felt familiar pain that had been suppressed for 12 years returning alongside physical sensation, recognizing that Maya's insight touched truth about experiences he'd never discussed with anyone because sharing grief would have required vulnerability that judicial authority couldn't afford when maintaining control required emotional detachment from circumstances that affected legal decision-making. Maya, how could divine insight reveal information about personal experiences that aren't part of public records or court proceedings? Judge Harrison, divine insight reveals truth that human records can't contain when supernatural understanding serves healing purposes that address spiritual wounds alongside physical injuries. Maya, what spiritual wounds are you referring to that affect my judicial decision-making? Judge Harrison, spiritual wounds created when your daughter was killed by drunk driver who received minimal sentence because wealth purchased legal representation that served criminal protection rather than victim justice. The words hit Judge Harrison like physical blows that eliminated his ability to maintain professional composure while confronting truth he'd spent 12 years trying to suppress through judicial authority that seemed to provide control over circumstances he couldn't otherwise influence. Maya, how do you know about Sarah? Judge Harrison, divine revelation provides knowledge about experiences that shape people's ability to recognize justice when personal tragedy creates spiritual blindness that prevents mercy from serving community welfare. Maya, Sarah's death and my paralysis are separate tragedies that don't affect my ability to evaluate criminal evidence through established legal procedures. Judge Harrison, Sarah's death and your paralysis serve the same injustice when legal procedures protect wealth rather than truth, creating spiritual wounds that prevent recognition of innocence when prosecutorial corruption destroys other families the way drunk driving destroyed yours. Judge Harrison felt 12 years of suppressed grief returning as physical healing continued revealing emotional wounds that had been masked by professional authority designed to prevent vulnerability that might affect judicial decision-making through personal investment in case outcomes. Maya, Sarah was 16 when she was killed by Marcus Whitmore, whose family wealth purchased legal representation that reduced vehicular manslaughter charges to reckless driving with 18 months probation instead of prison sentence that would have served justice. Judge Harrison and Marcus Whitmore's legal protection taught you that wealth could purchase escape from criminal consequences, while poor defendants faced harsh sentences for lesser crimes. Maya, Marcus Whitmore's case taught me that legal institutions serve economic interests rather than victim welfare, creating cynicism about justice that made harsh sentences seem appropriate for defendants who couldn't afford superior legal representation. Judge Harrison, but harsh sentences that serve cynicism rather than justice destroy innocent families while failing to address actual crime or protect community safety from real criminals. Maya, harsh sentences serve community protection by removing criminals from society regardless of economic circumstances that affect quality of legal representation. Judge Harrison, but harsh sentences based on manufactured evidence remove innocent people while allowing real criminals to remain free because prosecutorial corruption serves conviction statistics rather than actual crime prevention. Maya recognized that Judge Harrison's cynicism about justice had been shaped by personal tragedy that taught him to expect unfairness rather than understanding that divine justice served truth through human institutions when those institutions chose mercy alongside accountability, protection alongside punishment. Judge Harrison, what if divine healing is offering you opportunity to serve justice that honors Sarah's memory through protecting innocent families, rather than destroying them through cynicism that serves prosecutorial corruption? Maya, how would protecting innocent families honor Sarah's memory when her killer escaped justice through legal procedures that served wealth rather than victim welfare? Judge Harrison, protecting innocent families honors Sarah's memory by ensuring that legal procedures serve truth rather than wealth, preventing other families from experiencing injustice while creating a justice system that would have protected Sarah if divine mercy had guided legal institutions. Maya, divine mercy doesn't guide legal institutions that operate according to established procedures, rather than supernatural intervention that cannot be verified through objective standards. Judge Harrison, divine mercy guides legal institutions through people who choose justice over corruption, truth over wealth, mercy over cynicism that destroys innocent families while failing to protect community welfare. Maya, and you believe divine healing gives me ability to choose justice over corruption despite legal evidence that establishes your father's guilt through multiple independent sources? Judge Harrison, divine healing gives you ability to investigate legal evidence that has been manufactured through prosecutorial corruption when supernatural insight reveals truth that legal procedures refuse to acknowledge. Judge Harrison felt recognition settling around Maya's perspective, understanding that his cynicism about justice had made him resistant to investigating prosecutorial misconduct because accepting corruption would require acknowledging that his harsh sentencing had been serving institutional dysfunction rather than community protection. Maya, what specific prosecutorial corruption do you believe divine insight reveals about your father's case? Judge Harrison, divine insight reveals that D.A. Vance receives financial benefits from conviction statistics that serve political advancement rather than community safety, creating incentives for manufacturing evidence against innocent defendants who can't afford adequate legal representation. Maya, financial corruption in prosecutorial offices would require documentation that investigative authorities could verify through auditing procedures, rather than supernatural revelation that cannot be objectively confirmed. Judge Harrison, supernatural revelation provides guidance for discovering documentation when divine intervention gives people courage to expose corruption rather than accepting prosecutorial intimidation that prevents whistleblower testimony. Maya, whistleblower testimony about prosecutorial corruption would require protection that courts might not be able to provide against retaliation from law enforcement agencies that control investigation procedures. Judge Harrison, divine protection provides security that courts cannot offer when supernatural intervention serves justice purposes that require exposing corruption despite institutional resistance to truth that threatens established power structures. As their conversation continued through midnight hours in chambers where Judge Harrison had made decisions based on cynicism rather than hope, both felt understanding developing about the relationship between personal healing and social justice, individual restoration and community welfare, divine intervention and human responsibility for creating institutions that serve truth rather than wealth. Maya, Judge Harrison said, if what you're suggesting about prosecutorial corruption is true, then my judicial decisions have been serving institutional dysfunction rather than community protection, creating injustice while believing I was preventing injustice. Judge Harrison, recognizing institutional dysfunction provides opportunity for serving actual justice through divine guidance that heals both personal wounds and social corruption when supernatural intervention gives people courage to choose truth over professional safety. Maya, choosing truth over professional safety could destroy my judicial career while exposing prosecutorial corruption that affects cases beyond your father's individual situation. Judge Harrison, serving divine justice that protects innocent families honors Sarah's memory more effectively than protecting judicial career that serves institutional corruption while destroying families the way drunk driving destroyed yours. Maya, and you believe divine healing gives me strength to investigate prosecutorial corruption despite professional risks that could eliminate my ability to serve justice through judicial authority? Judge Harrison, divine healing gives you strength to serve justice through divine authority that protects truth when judicial authority serves corruption that legal procedures refuse to acknowledge or address effectively. As dawn light began filtering through chamber windows where Judge Harrison had confronted personal truth that explained his cynical approach to justice while recognizing opportunities for spiritual healing that accompanied physical restoration, both understood that divine intervention was offering him choice between maintaining institutional authority that served corruption or accepting supernatural authority that served truth through protection of innocent families from prosecutorial misconduct. Maya, he said, what divine healing has revealed about Sarah's death and my paralysis is that personal tragedy doesn't justify institutional cynicism that destroys other families, and that serving justice requires courage to investigate corruption even when investigation threatens professional security. Judge Harrison, divine healing reveals that justice serves love rather than cynicism when supernatural intervention provides strength for protecting innocent families while honoring memory of those who were destroyed by institutional corruption that legal procedures refuse to address. Maya, if I choose to investigate prosecutorial corruption in your father's case, what divine guidance would help me discover truth that serves justice rather than just creating more institutional dysfunction? Judge Harrison, divine guidance provides wisdom for exposing corruption through legal procedures that protect innocent people while creating accountability that serves community welfare rather than prosecutorial advancement through conviction statistics. The backstory had been unveiled. Judge Harrison's cynicism about justice had been created by his daughter's death and his own paralysis, both resulting from institutional failure to hold wealthy criminals accountable while harsh sentences destroyed poor families for lesser crimes, creating spiritual blindness that prevented recognition of mercy and justice serving community welfare through divine intervention that protected innocent families from prosecutorial corruption. But divine healing was offering redemption through restored faith in justice that served truth rather than wealth, mercy rather than cynicism, supernatural intervention rather than institutional authority that perpetuated corruption by refusing to investigate prosecutorial misconduct that destroyed innocent families while failing to protect community safety from actual criminals. Have you ever experienced personal tragedy that made you lose faith in justice or fairness? Share your thoughts on how healing from past wounds can help us serve others with compassion rather than cynicism. The revelations had created foundation for spiritual transformation that would serve Maya's family while healing Judge Harrison's soul, proving that divine intervention could serve both individual restoration and social justice when people chose supernatural authority over institutional protection, truth over corruption, mercy over cynicism that perpetuated injustice by refusing to acknowledge that legal institutions could serve divine purposes when guided by love rather than wealth. The transformation that would cement their spiritual partnership began at dawn in Judge Harrison's chambers, when the revelation about his daughter Sarah's death had stripped away 12 years of cynical armor while divine healing continued restoring not only his physical mobility but his capacity for faith and justice that served truth rather than institutional protection, creating emotional intimacy between a broken judge and a young healer whose desperate love had awakened possibilities for redemption that neither had imagined possible. Maya, Judge Harrison said, standing at his chamber windows where morning light illuminated legs that moved normally for the first time since tragedy had taught him that life was fundamentally cruel and unfair. What you've revealed about Sarah's death and the connection to my spiritual blindness about justice makes me understand that divine healing serves purposes beyond individual restoration. Judge Harrison, Maya replied, settling in a chair where she'd spent the night helping him process truth about experiences that had shaped his cynical approach to legal decisions. Divine healing serves community restoration when individual healing creates courage for exposing corruption that destroys innocent families while dishonoring memory of victims whose deaths should inspire justice rather than cynicism. Maya, Sarah's death created cynicism that made me believe harsh sentences served justice even when evidence was questionable, because I wanted other people to suffer consequences that Marcus Whitmore escaped through wealth. Judge Harrison, Sarah's death was meant to inspire mercy that protects innocent families from institutional corruption, not cynicism that destroys families while failing to address actual crime that threatens community safety. Maya, how do you distinguish between justice that serves community protection and revenge that serves personal pain when legal decisions affect defendants whose guilt or innocence might be uncertain? Judge Harrison, divine justice serves community protection through truth that exposes actual criminals while protecting innocent families, rather than revenge that destroys anyone available when actual criminals escape consequences through wealth and corruption. Judge Harrison felt emotional barriers that had protected him from vulnerability for 12 years dissolving under Maya's patient guidance, recognizing that her spiritual wisdom exceeded her chronological age because divine insight provided understanding that came from supernatural sources rather than just human experience. Maya, what divine insight helps you understand the difference between justice and revenge when both responses to crime affect community safety and victim welfare? Judge Harrison, divine insight reveals that justice serves love through truth that protects innocent people while holding guilty people accountable, while revenge serves pain through punishment that destroys anyone available when actual accountability becomes impossible through corruption. Maya, and love serves community welfare more effectively than pain when legal decisions affect families who might be innocent despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. Judge Harrison, love serves community welfare by ensuring that legal decisions protect truth rather than serving prosecutorial advancement, preventing innocent families from being destroyed while actual criminals remain free to threaten community safety. Maya, what would love-based justice look like in your father's case if divine insight reveals truth about manufactured evidence that legal procedures have failed to investigate? Judge Harrison, love-based justice would expose prosecutorial corruption that manufactured evidence against my father, while protecting actual criminals who committed robberies that DA Vance refuses to investigate because corruption serves conviction statistics rather than community safety. Judge Harrison moved around his chambers with restored mobility while processing emotional healing that accompanied physical restoration, understanding that Maya's presence had catalyzed transformation that went beyond miraculous intervention to include spiritual awakening that made serving justice feel possible rather than futile. Maya, if divine healing is giving me courage to investigate prosecutorial corruption despite professional risks, what guidance would help me discover truth that serves your father's innocence while exposing systematic problems that affect other families? Judge Harrison, divine guidance provides wisdom for using judicial authority to protect truth when legal procedures serve corruption, creating accountability that honors Sarah's memory through justice that prevents other families from experiencing similar injustice. Maya, using judicial authority to investigate prosecutorial misconduct could destroy my career while creating controversy that might not result in actual justice for your father or other defendants. Judge Harrison, serving divine justice that protects innocent families honors Sarah's memory more effectively than protecting judicial career that serves institutional corruption while failing to prevent community harm that legal procedures refuse to address. Maya, what if investigating prosecutorial corruption reveals that I've been contributing to institutional injustice through harsh sentences that destroyed innocent families while believing I was serving community protection? Judge Harrison, recognizing past mistakes provides opportunity for serving actual justice through divine redemption that heals institutional corruption alongside personal wounds when supernatural intervention guides legal decisions toward truth rather than revenge. As Judge Harrison embraced possibilities for redemption while Maya provided spiritual guidance that exceeded typical attorney-client or victim-judicial relationships, both felt emotional connection developing that transcended their respective roles in legal proceedings to become partnership in divine justice that served community welfare through individual healing. Maya, Judge Harrison said, what you've given me through divine healing goes beyond physical restoration to include spiritual restoration that makes serving justice feel meaningful rather than just procedural. Judge Harrison, what you're offering through judicial courage goes beyond my father's individual case to include systematic justice that serves community welfare when divine authority guides legal institutions toward truth rather than corruption. Maya, judicial courage that serves divine authority rather than institutional protection feels both terrifying and exhilarating because it requires faith that supernatural intervention can create better outcomes than professional safety. Judge Harrison, divine authority provides better outcomes than institutional protection when supernatural intervention gives people strength for serving truth despite professional risks that seem overwhelming but actually serve justice purposes. Maya, what specific steps would divine authority guide me to take for investigating prosecutorial corruption while protecting your father from continued institutional persecution? Judge Harrison, divine authority guides legal investigation that exposes financial connections between DA Vance and actual criminals, surveillance evidence showing real perpetrators, witness testimony revealing planted evidence, and documentation proving systematic corruption that serves political advancement rather than community safety. Maya, legal investigation that challenges prosecutorial evidence would require resources and authority that judges don't typically possess for investigating law enforcement agencies that control criminal procedures. Judge Harrison, divine investigation provides resources through supernatural revelation that guides human investigation toward evidence that exposes corruption when legal procedures serve institutional protection rather than truth. Maya, supernatural revelation that guides human investigation sounds like partnership between divine authority and judicial authority for serving justice that legal institutions alone cannot provide through normal procedures. Judge Harrison, divine partnership with judicial authority serves justice purposes when human institutions prove inadequate for protecting innocent families from corruption that legal procedures refuse to acknowledge or address effectively. As their conversation continued through morning hours that found them planning investigation strategies while spiritual connection deepened into partnership that served justice rather than just individual welfare, both understood that divine healing had created emotional bond that transcended typical legal relationships to become collaboration in supernatural justice. Maya, Judge Harrison said, what you've taught me about divine justice is that supernatural intervention doesn't replace human responsibility, but enhances human capacity for serving truth when institutions serve corruption rather than community welfare. Judge Harrison, what you've learned about judicial responsibility is that legal authority can serve divine purposes when guided by supernatural wisdom rather than institutional pressure that protects corruption while destroying innocent families. Maya, serving divine purposes through judicial authority requires courage that I haven't possessed since Sarah's death taught me that justice was impossible rather than just difficult when wealth purchases criminal protection. Judge Harrison, divine courage provides strength for serving justice that honors Sarah's memory through protecting other families from institutional corruption, proving that personal tragedy can inspire mercy rather than just cynicism. Maya, if I commit to investigating prosecutorial corruption in your father's case regardless of professional consequences, what divine guidance would sustain courage when institutional resistance creates pressure to abandon truth for professional safety? Judge Harrison, divine guidance sustains courage through spiritual connection that proves supernatural authority more reliable than institutional protection when serving justice requires faith alongside investigation that exposes corruption. Maya, spiritual connection with divine authority through human partnership sounds like relationship that serves justice purposes rather than just individual comfort during legal proceedings. Judge Harrison, spiritual partnership serves justice through human collaboration that reflects divine love when supernatural intervention guides legal decisions toward truth rather than institutional advancement that destroys community welfare. As Judge Harrison prepared to use his restored mobility and renewed faith to begin investigating prosecutorial corruption, while Maya provided spiritual guidance that would sustain his courage through professional risks that threatened everything he'd built through judicial career, both felt emotional bonding that created foundation for partnership in divine justice. Maya, he said, I commit to serving divine justice that protects your father while exposing prosecutorial corruption that affects other families, regardless of professional consequences that threaten judicial career built on institutional authority rather than supernatural guidance. Judge Harrison, I commit to providing spiritual support that sustains your courage while divine authority guides investigation that serves community welfare through truth that honors Sarah's memory alongside my father's innocence. Maya, what our partnership proves is that divine intervention can heal both individual wounds and institutional corruption when people choose supernatural authority over professional protection that serves wealth rather than justice. Judge Harrison, what our spiritual connection demonstrates is that emotional bonding can serve justice purposes when human relationship reflects divine love that protects innocent families while creating accountability for corruption that destroys community welfare. Their emotional bonding had created more than just alliance between judge and defendant's daughter. It had established spiritual partnership and divine justice that would transform legal proceedings from institutional protection of corruption into supernatural revelation of truth that served community welfare through individual courage, guided by divine authority that proved more reliable than human institutions when those institutions served wealth rather than justice. Judge Harrison's physical healing had been completed through Maya's supernatural intervention, but their emotional bonding had created ongoing spiritual relationship that would sustain investigation of prosecutorial corruption while providing divine guidance for legal decisions that served truth rather than institutional advancement, proving that miraculous healing could serve both individual restoration and social justice when guided by love rather than revenge, mercy rather than cynicism, divine authority rather than human protection that perpetuated corruption by refusing to acknowledge supernatural intervention serving justice purposes. The transformation was complete. Cynical judge had become divine instrument of justice. Desperate daughter had become spiritual guide for institutional reform. Individual healing had become community restoration through partnership that proved supernatural intervention could serve systematic change when people chose divine authority over professional safety, truth over corruption, love over cynicism that destroyed innocent families while failing to protect community welfare from actual criminals who escaped consequences through wealth and prosecutorial misconduct. The crisis that would threaten to destroy everything Judge Harrison and Maya had built together arrived in the form of an emergency judicial review board hearing, when District Attorney Patricia Vance's desperate attempts to suppress investigation into prosecutorial corruption led to accusations that Judge Harrison's miraculous recovery was evidence of mental incompetence requiring immediate removal from the bench before his divine partnership with Maya could expose the systematic fraud that had built her career on innocent people suffering. Your Honor, said Chief Justice Margaret Thornfield, presiding over the emergency hearing that had been called at D.A. Vance's urgent request, this review board has been convened to evaluate allegations that Judge Harrison's recent behavior demonstrates judicial incompetence requiring suspension pending psychiatric evaluation. The hearing was taking place in the state's highest courtroom, where Judge Harrison sat facing colleagues whose institutional loyalty would be tested by evidence of divine intervention that challenged their understanding of legal authority, while threatening prosecutorial corruption that extended throughout the judicial system they'd spent careers protecting through professional silence about systematic misconduct. Chief Justice Thornfield, replied Harrison's hastily assembled attorney, Marcus Chun, whose defense of judicial authority would require arguing that supernatural healing enhanced rather than compromised legal decision-making capabilities. Judge Harrison's recent recovery from paralysis represents medical improvement that supports rather than undermines his fitness for judicial service. Mr. Chun, Chief Justice Thornfield continued, consulting allegations that portrayed Judge Harrison's divine healing as evidence of psychological breakdown requiring immediate intervention, medical improvement doesn't address concerns about Judge Harrison's claims regarding supernatural intervention affecting legal decisions about criminal cases. Chief Justice Thornfield, supernatural intervention that restores physical mobility could reasonably be expected to enhance rather than impair cognitive function necessary for judicial decision-making. Mr. Chun, but supernatural intervention that influences legal decisions about criminal guilt or innocence raises concerns about judicial objectivity that serves legal standards rather than religious beliefs that cannot be verified through established procedures. Maya sat in the gallery watching institutional forces mobilize to destroy Judge Harrison's career before their investigation could expose prosecutorial corruption, understanding that D.A. Vance's attack represented desperate attempt to prevent divine revelation from revealing truth that would destroy careers built on conviction statistics rather than actual justice or community safety. Chief Justice Thornfield, said D.A. Vance, presenting evidence designed to portray Judge Harrison as mentally incompetent rather than divinely guided, Judge Harrison's recent statements about supernatural healing affecting his judicial decisions demonstrate psychological instability that compromises his ability to evaluate criminal evidence through objective legal analysis. D.A. Vance, what specific statement suggests psychological instability rather than religious beliefs that many judges maintain alongside professional responsibilities? Chief Justice Thornfield, Judge Harrison has claimed that divine intervention revealed prosecutorial misconduct in criminal cases where established evidence supports conviction through multiple independent sources of verification. D.A. Vance, claims about prosecutorial misconduct require investigation rather than psychiatric evaluation when such claims are based on evidence rather than just religious revelation. Chief Justice Thornfield, Judge Harrison's claims about prosecutorial misconduct are based on supernatural revelation rather than legal evidence that can be verified through established investigative procedures. D.A. Vance, supernatural revelation that guides investigation of prosecutorial misconduct could produce legal evidence if such investigation reveals verifiable facts about corruption. Maya felt divine guidance prompting her to stand and address the review board despite procedures that typically excluded public comment from judicial competency hearings, understanding that supernatural intervention was creating opportunities for exposing truth that legal procedures were designed to suppress through institutional protection. Chief Justice Thornfield, Maya said, rising from the gallery with authority that seemed impossible from a 16-year-old girl whose family's poverty had rendered them powerless against institutional corruption, I request permission to provide evidence relevant to Judge Harrison's competency that demonstrates divine intervention serving justice rather than compromising legal objectivity. Ms. Rodriguez, judicial competency hearings don't typically include testimony from family members of defendants in cases that raise concerns about judicial decision-making. Chief Justice Thornfield, divine intervention that demonstrates supernatural power serving justice purposes provides relevant evidence about judicial competency when legal competency includes ability to recognize truth that serves community welfare. Ms. Rodriguez, divine intervention cannot be evaluated through legal standards that require objective verification rather than religious claims that lack scientific documentation. Chief Justice Thornfield, divine intervention can be objectively verified through miraculous healing that medical science confirms while refusing to explain through natural causes that cannot account for impossible restoration. Ms. Rodriguez, medical documentation of unexplained improvement doesn't constitute evidence of divine intervention affecting judicial competency for evaluating criminal cases. Chief Justice Thornfield, medical documentation of impossible healing proves supernatural power that can reveal truth about criminal cases when legal procedures serve corruption rather than investigating actual evidence. D.A. Vance approached the bench with documentation designed to destroy Maya's credibility while preventing investigation that would expose systematic corruption throughout prosecutorial offices that served political advancement rather than community safety or individual justice. Chief Justice Thornfield, Ms. Rodriguez has been evaluated by psychiatric professionals who confirm delusional beliefs about supernatural healing abilities that indicate mental illness requiring treatment rather than judicial consideration. Chief Justice Thornfield, Maya replied, psychiatric evaluation that labels divine intervention as mental illness serves institutional protection from supernatural truth that exposes corruption when legal institutions refuse to investigate prosecutorial misconduct. Ms. Rodriguez, psychiatric evaluation serves legitimate medical purposes rather than institutional protection when mental health assessment indicates treatment needs that affect individual welfare. Chief Justice Thornfield, psychiatric evaluation serves institutional protection when medical assessment labels divine truth as mental illness to prevent supernatural intervention from exposing corruption that destroys innocent families. Ms. Rodriguez, divine truth cannot be distinguished from mental illness through legal procedures that require objective verification rather than subjective religious experiences. Chief Justice Thornfield, divine truth can be objectively verified through miraculous healing that proves supernatural power capable of revealing prosecutorial corruption when human investigation serves institutional protection rather than community welfare. Judge Harrison felt institutional pressure mounting against divine authority, while recognizing that his colleagues' resistance to supernatural intervention reflected spiritual blindness that prevented recognition of justice-serving truth, rather than professional advancement through conviction statistics that destroyed innocent families. Chief Justice Thornfield, he said, the review board's evaluation of my competency should include evidence of my restored physical and mental capabilities, rather than focusing exclusively on religious beliefs that enhance rather than compromise my ability to serve justice. Judge Harrison, religious beliefs that influence legal decisions about criminal guilt or innocence raise concerns about judicial objectivity that serves legal standards rather than supernatural interpretation of evidence. Chief Justice Thornfield, supernatural interpretation that reveals prosecutorial corruption serves legal standards more effectively than objective analysis that ignores institutional misconduct because investigation threatens professional relationships. Judge Harrison, prosecutorial misconduct requires legal investigation rather than supernatural revelation when such misconduct can be documented through established procedures for exposing corruption. Chief Justice Thornfield, established procedures for exposing prosecutorial corruption serve institutional protection rather than truth when those procedures are controlled by people who benefit from maintaining corruption that advances their careers. Judge Harrison, if prosecutorial corruption exists in cases under your jurisdiction, such corruption should be addressed through appropriate legal channels rather than divine intervention that cannot be verified through objective standards. Chief Justice Thornfield, divine intervention provides objective verification through miraculous healing that demonstrates supernatural power capable of exposing corruption when legal channels serve institutional protection rather than truth. As the hearing continued with institutional resistance to divine intervention mounting while DA Vance's accusations gained support from judicial colleagues whose careers depended on maintaining prosecutorial relationships that served professional advancement rather than community welfare, Maya felt supernatural guidance directing her toward revelation that would expose systematic corruption. Chief Justice Thornfield, she said, divine intervention that healed Judge Harrison's paralysis also provides revelation about financial corruption connecting DA Vance to criminal organizations that benefit from prosecutorial protection rather than law enforcement that serves community safety. Ms. Rodriguez, accusations of financial corruption require evidence rather than supernatural claims that cannot be verified through legal investigation. Chief Justice Thornfield, supernatural claims provide guidance for legal investigation that reveals financial evidence when divine intervention gives people courage to expose corruption despite prosecutorial intimidation. Ms. Rodriguez, legal investigation guided by supernatural claims lacks objectivity necessary for determining facts about prosecutorial conduct. Chief Justice Thornfield, legal investigation guided by divine revelation provides objectivity that serves truth rather than institutional protection when human objectivity serves professional relationships that benefit from maintaining corruption. DA Vance felt her carefully constructed career beginning to crumble under Maya's supernatural insight, recognizing that divine intervention was creating exactly the kind of exposure that her corruption required, preventing through elimination of Judge Harrison's authority before investigation could reveal financial connections that would destroy her political advancement alongside her freedom. Chief Justice Thornfield, she said with desperate urgency, Ms. Rodriguez's claims about financial corruption demonstrate the same delusional thinking that has compromised Judge Harrison's ability to distinguish between legal evidence and religious fantasy. Chief Justice Thornfield, Maya replied, DA Vance's resistance to investigation of financial corruption demonstrates institutional protection that serves prosecutorial advancement rather than community welfare when divine revelation threatens careers built on conviction statistics. Ms. Rodriguez, divine revelation cannot substitute for legal evidence when evaluating accusations that require objective verification through established investigative procedures. Chief Justice Thornfield, divine revelation guides legal evidence when objective verification serves truth rather than institutional protection that prevents investigation of corruption because exposure threatens professional relationships. As the review board prepared to vote on Judge Harrison's competency, while DA Vance's accusations gained institutional support that threatened to eliminate divine authority before supernatural intervention could complete exposure of prosecutorial corruption, the shatterpoint had arrived where spiritual truth would either triumph over institutional protection or be destroyed by professional forces that served wealth rather than justice. Chief Justice Thornfield, Judge Harrison said, this review board faces choice between maintaining institutional authority that protects corruption or accepting divine authority that serves truth through supernatural intervention that has restored my capacity for recognizing justice. Judge Harrison, this review board serves legal authority that protects judicial integrity through established standards, rather than religious authority that cannot be verified through objective procedures. Chief Justice Thornfield, legal authority that protects judicial integrity should welcome investigation of prosecutorial corruption, rather than suppressing divine intervention that exposes institutional misconduct affecting community welfare. Judge Harrison, divine intervention that claims to expose prosecutorial corruption requires verification through legal procedures, rather than acceptance through religious faith that affects judicial objectivity. Chief Justice Thornfield, religious faith that enhances judicial objectivity through divine guidance serves legal procedures more effectively than institutional loyalty that prevents investigation of corruption because exposure threatens professional relationships. As the hearing approached its climax with institutional forces mobilized to destroy Judge Harrison's career, while Maya's supernatural intervention faced suppression through psychiatric evaluation that would eliminate divine authority before truth could be revealed, Both understood that the Shatterpoint would determine whether spiritual justice could survive institutional resistance designed to protect corruption through professional solidarity that served wealth rather than community welfare. The next phase would reveal whether divine intervention could create sufficient evidence to expose prosecutorial corruption before institutional protection could eliminate Judge Harrison's authority and Maya's credibility through psychiatric evaluation that labeled supernatural truth as mental illness requiring treatment rather than judicial consideration that served justice through divine guidance. The decision that would determine their future came at exactly 4:17 p.m. when Chief Justice Thornfield announced a 30-minute recess before the review board would vote on Judge Harrison's competency, creating the moment when he would either surrender to institutional pressure that protected prosecutorial corruption or make the ultimate sacrifice of his judicial career to stand with Maya in exposing truth that served divine justice rather than professional survival. Maya, Judge Harrison said as they found themselves alone in the courthouse chapel where he had come to pray for guidance while facing the most important choice of his life, I need to understand something about divine intervention that goes beyond healing my paralysis or exposing prosecutorial corruption. Maya knelt beside him in the small sanctuary where afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows depicting scenes of justice and mercy, understanding that Judge Harrison's questions reflected spiritual crisis that accompanied recognition that serving divine authority might require sacrificing everything he built through 23 years of judicial service. Judge Harrison, what do you need to understand about divine intervention? Maya, I need to understand whether choosing divine justice over institutional protection serves community welfare, when such choice destroys my ability to serve justice through judicial authority that institutional resistance might eliminate completely. Judge Harrison, serving divine justice through institutional authority that exposes corruption serves community welfare more effectively than protecting judicial authority that serves corruption through institutional silence about prosecutorial misconduct. Maya, but losing judicial authority through institutional retaliation might eliminate my ability to protect your father or other innocent defendants from prosecutorial corruption that continues destroying families. Judge Harrison, maintaining judicial authority that serves institutional protection rather than divine truth enables prosecutorial corruption to continue destroying families while creating appearance of justice that actually serves corruption. Maya, what if choosing divine intervention over institutional loyalty results in psychiatric evaluation that destroys my credibility while allowing DA Vance to continue prosecutorial misconduct without judicial oversight? Judge Harrison, choosing divine intervention over institutional loyalty creates opportunity for exposing prosecutorial misconduct through supernatural revelation that provides evidence capable of destroying corruption, regardless of psychiatric evaluation. Judge Harrison felt the weight of decision that would affect not only his professional future, but the welfare of countless families whose cases would be decided by judges who either served divine justice or institutional protection depending on whether his choice inspired courage or confirmed that challenging corruption required sacrificing everything. Maya, what divine guidance helps me understand whether protecting my judicial career serves justice purposes or whether sacrificing judicial career serves justice purposes when those choices seem mutually exclusive? Judge Harrison, divine guidance reveals that protecting judicial career that serves institutional corruption destroys justice purposes, while sacrificing judicial career that exposes corruption serves justice purposes through supernatural intervention that creates systematic change. Maya, systematic change through supernatural intervention sounds like divine revolution that challenges institutional authority through spiritual authority that legal systems cannot acknowledge or accommodate. Judge Harrison, divine revolution serves justice through spiritual authority when legal systems serve corruption rather than truth, creating institutional change that protects innocent families while exposing crime that wealth purchases protection from prosecution. Maya, divine revolution that challenges legal systems could inspire other judges to investigate prosecutorial corruption or could result in institutional resistance that eliminates judicial independence entirely. Judge Harrison, divine revolution that inspires judicial courage to expose corruption serves justice more effectively than judicial independence that maintains institutional silence about prosecutorial misconduct affecting community welfare. As Judge Harrison wrestled with choice between professional survival and divine calling while Maya provided spiritual guidance that exceeded her chronological years, both felt supernatural presence that seemed to be waiting for human decision about whether earthly authority would serve heavenly purposes or continue serving wealth through corruption. Maya, If I choose to continue investigating prosecutorial corruption despite institutional pressure that threatens my judicial career, what divine protection would sustain courage when professional consequences become overwhelming? Judge Harrison, divine protection provides strength for serving truth when professional consequences seem overwhelming but actually serve justice purposes by proving that corruption requires destroying careers that threaten institutional misconduct. Maya, divine protection that proves corruption through professional retaliation, sounds like spiritual strategy that uses institutional resistance to expose systematic problems affecting entire judicial system. Judge Harrison, spiritual strategy uses institutional resistance to demonstrate that legal systems serve corruption when exposing truth requires sacrificing careers, rather than being rewarded through professional advancement. Maya, spiritual strategy that exposes systematic corruption could transform judicial systems or could result in eliminating judges who prioritize truth over institutional loyalty that maintains prosecutorial misconduct. Judge Harrison, eliminating judges who prioritize truth over institutional loyalty proves that judicial systems serve corruption rather than justice, creating evidence that supports divine intervention through systematic reform. Judge Harrison stood and began pacing the small chapel while processing decision that would determine whether his restored mobility would serve divine purposes or institutional protection, understanding that Maya's supernatural intervention had been designed to create exactly this moment of choice between competing authorities. Maya, what you're asking me to choose is between serving institutional authority that protects my career while enabling corruption or serving divine authority that destroys my career while exposing truth. Judge Harrison, divine authority asks you to choose between protecting career that serves corruption or sacrificing career that serves justice when those purposes require choosing truth over professional safety. Maya, sacrificing career that serves justice could eliminate my ability to protect other innocent defendants if divine intervention doesn't create systematic change that prevents future prosecutorial misconduct. Judge Harrison, protecting career that serves corruption eliminates your ability to protect innocent defendants because institutional silence about prosecutorial misconduct enables systematic destruction of families while maintaining appearance of justice. Maya, and you believe divine intervention provides better protection for innocent defendants than judicial authority that serves institutional compromise between truth and corruption? Judge Harrison, divine intervention provides authentic protection through supernatural revelation that exposes corruption, while judicial authority that serves institutional compromise provides false protection that maintains corruption while destroying innocent families. Maya, authentic protection through supernatural revelation requires faith that divine intervention can create institutional change when human intervention has failed to address prosecutorial corruption through normal legal procedures. Judge Harrison, divine intervention creates institutional change through human cooperation that serves supernatural purposes when legal procedures serve institutional protection rather than community welfare or individual justice. As the 30-minute recess approached its end while Judge Harrison faced return to review board hearing that would determine his judicial future based on institutional loyalty rather than divine calling, he felt certainty settling around choice that would define not only his career but his spiritual destiny. Maya, he said, I choose divine justice over institutional protection, supernatural authority over judicial career, truth that serves community welfare over professional safety that enables corruption. Judge Harrison, choosing divine justice over institutional protection honors Sarah's memory through courage that prevents other families from experiencing injustice while exposing corruption that destroys innocent people. Maya, what practical steps will serve divine justice when institutional retaliation attempts to eliminate my judicial authority before investigation can expose prosecutorial corruption? Judge Harrison, divine justice provides practical steps through supernatural revelation that guides legal investigation toward evidence that exposes corruption regardless of institutional attempts to eliminate judicial authority. Maya, supernatural revelation that guides legal investigation sounds like partnership between divine intervention and human courage that serves justice purposes despite professional consequences. Judge Harrison, divine partnership with human courage creates justice that serves community welfare when institutional partnership serves corruption through professional advancement that destroys families while protecting criminal activity. Maya, if I return to the review board and announce my commitment to investigating prosecutorial corruption despite psychiatric evaluation that labels divine intervention as mental illness, what spiritual strength will sustain courage when institutional pressure becomes overwhelming? Judge Harrison, spiritual strength provides courage through divine connection that proves more reliable than institutional approval when serving truth requires faith that supernatural intervention serves justice purposes. Maya, divine connection that proves more reliable than institutional approval requires trust that spiritual authority can protect truth when human authority serves corruption through professional intimidation. Judge Harrison, spiritual authority protects truth through supernatural intervention that creates evidence capable of exposing corruption, regardless of professional intimidation designed to suppress divine revelation. As they prepared to return to the hearing where Judge Harrison would either submit to institutional pressure or announce his commitment to divine justice that would likely destroy his judicial career while potentially exposing systematic corruption throughout prosecutorial offices, both felt supernatural presence that seemed to approve human decision to serve heavenly purposes despite earthly consequences. Maya, Judge Harrison said, "What I commit to when I choose divine justice is serving truth that honors Sarah's memory while protecting your father and other innocent families from prosecutorial corruption, regardless of professional consequences that threaten judicial career." Judge Harrison, what divine justice commits to when you choose supernatural authority is providing evidence that exposes corruption while creating systematic change that serves community welfare through individual courage guided by spiritual wisdom. Maya, individual courage guided by spiritual wisdom sounds like divine calling that transforms personal healing into community service when institutional healing requires sacrificing professional safety for truth. Judge Harrison, divine calling transforms personal healing into community service through supernatural intervention that proves spiritual authority more powerful than institutional authority when serving justice purposes. When have you had to choose between what was professionally safe and what you knew was right? Share your thoughts on how standing up for truth sometimes requires risking everything we've worked to build. As they walked toward the courtroom where Judge Harrison would announce his choice between institutional survival and divine justice, both carried certainty that supernatural intervention had prepared this moment when human courage would either serve heavenly purposes or surrender to earthly pressure that protected corruption through professional loyalty rather than community welfare. The choice had been made. Judge Harrison would risk everything to expose prosecutorial corruption while serving divine justice that protected innocent families, proving that spiritual authority provided better security than institutional protection when that protection required maintaining silence about systematic misconduct that destroyed community welfare through individual careers that served wealth rather than truth. Their partnership in divine justice would face institutional retaliation designed to eliminate supernatural intervention before truth could create systematic change. But spiritual authority would prove more powerful than human authority when serving justice purposes that honored both Sarah's memory and Maya's father's innocence through courage that sacrificed professional safety for community welfare that legal institutions refused to protect through normal procedures. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan buzzed with unprecedented activity as reporters, legal scholars, and families of wrongfully convicted defendants gathered to witness the conclusion of United States v. Vance. The corruption case that had begun with a 16-year-old girl's impossible offer to heal a paralyzed judge and had culminated in the largest prosecutorial misconduct investigation in California history, proving that divine intervention could indeed serve justice when human courage chose supernatural authority over institutional protection. "Your Honor," said federal prosecutor Sarah Mitchell, addressing Judge Patricia Romano, who presided over proceedings that would determine sentencing for corruption that had destroyed hundreds of innocent families while enriching those who perverted justice for personal gain. The evidence presented over the past 6 months demonstrates systematic prosecutorial misconduct spanning 12 years and affecting over 300 criminal cases. Maya Rodriguez sat in the front row beside her father Miguel, whose exoneration had been the first of many victories that followed Judge Harrison's courageous decision to investigate divine revelation rather than submit to institutional pressure. Watching as justice finally served truth rather than wealth through legal proceedings guided by supernatural intervention that had exposed corruption extending throughout the state's prosecutorial system. The defendant Patricia Vance, prosecutor Mitchell continued, used her position as district attorney to manufacture evidence, intimidate witnesses, and accept bribes from criminal organizations in exchange for prosecutorial protection that allowed actual criminals to escape justice while innocent defendants faced life imprisonment. Mrs. Vance's corruption was facilitated by a network of complicit law enforcement officials, forensic technicians, and judicial personnel who prioritized conviction statistics over community safety, creating systematic injustice that destroyed families while enriching those who perverted legal institutions. Judge Harrison, whose courageous investigation had provided federal authorities with evidence necessary for exposing corruption that state procedures had refused to acknowledge, sat with Maya's family as his former colleague faced consequences that his divine partnership with Maya had made inevitable through supernatural guidance that revealed truth when human institutions served wealth rather than justice. The evidence includes financial records showing payments from criminal organizations to prosecutorial offices, video surveillance documenting evidence tampering, witness testimony revealing intimidation tactics, and digital forensics proving systematic manufacture of evidence against innocent defendants. The investigation that had followed Judge Harrison's commitment to divine justice had revealed corruption extending far beyond Maya's father's case, a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used prosecutorial authority to protect wealthy criminals while destroying poor families through manufactured evidence that served conviction statistics rather than community safety. Mrs. Vance personally received over $2 million in bribes while her office manufactured evidence in cases that resulted in 847 wrongful convictions, 12 wrongful executions, and immeasurable suffering for families whose lives were destroyed by institutional corruption disguised as legal justice. Maya felt divine satisfaction that accompanied earthly vindication, understanding that supernatural intervention had served purposes beyond healing Judge Harrison's paralysis or freeing her father to include systematic reform that would protect future families from prosecutorial corruption through legal procedures that now prioritize truth over institutional advancement. Your Honor, defense attorney Marcus Chin said, representing Patricia Vance despite overwhelming evidence of her guilt. While acknowledging serious misconduct in my client's prosecutorial career, I respectfully request consideration of mitigating factors including psychological pressure from political superiors who demanded conviction statistics that served electoral advancement rather than justice. Your Honor, Prosecutor Mitchell replied, psychological pressure from political superiors cannot mitigate systematic corruption that destroyed hundreds of innocent families while enriching criminal enterprises through prosecutorial protection that served personal advancement rather than community welfare. Mrs. Vance's corruption was deliberate, systematic, and devastating in its impact on community safety and individual justice. Federal sentencing guidelines recommend life imprisonment for corruption that affected hundreds of cases while facilitating criminal activity that threatened public welfare. Judge Romano consulted sentencing documentation that reflected not only Patricia Vance's individual crimes, but their systematic impact on community trust in legal institutions that were supposed to serve justice rather than personal advancement through conviction statistics that destroyed innocent families. Mrs. Vance, Judge Romano said, your corruption represents betrayal of public trust that undermines the foundation of legal institutions designed to serve community welfare rather than personal advancement through systematic misconduct. Your systematic manufacture of evidence, intimidation of witnesses, and acceptance of criminal bribes destroyed hundreds of innocent families while protecting criminal enterprises that threatened community safety through prosecutorial corruption. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, with additional restitution requirements that will compensate victims of your corruption while ensuring that criminal enterprise cannot continue threatening legal institutions through systematic misconduct. As Patricia Vance was led away to begin serving consequences that her corruption had made inevitable through divine intervention guided by supernatural justice, Maya felt spiritual completion that accompanied earthly vindication, understanding that her desperate offer to heal Judge Harrison's paralysis had created systematic change that served divine purposes through human courage. Miguel Rodriguez, Judge Romano continued, addressing Maya's father whose innocence had been proven through investigation that revealed systematic evidence manufacturing. This court formally apologizes for institutional failure that subjected you and your family to injustice that should never have occurred in legal systems designed to serve truth rather than corruption. Your conviction is hereby expunged from all legal records, with full restoration of civil rights and compensation for wrongful imprisonment that resulted from prosecutorial misconduct rather than criminal behavior. The state of California will provide financial restitution that acknowledges systematic failure while supporting your family's recovery from trauma that institutional corruption created through manufactured evidence. Miguel Rodriguez stood with dignity that had sustained his family through months of fighting false accusations, understanding that divine intervention through his daughter's supernatural gifts had created justice that human institutions had refused to provide through normal legal procedures that served wealth rather than truth. Your Honor, he said, what my family experienced through wrongful prosecution was devastating, but what we learned through divine intervention that exposed corruption was that supernatural justice serves community welfare when human justice serves institutional protection. My daughter Maya's courage to offer divine healing in exchange for truth has created systematic change that protects other families from prosecutorial corruption, while proving that spiritual authority can serve legal purposes when human authority serves corruption. I forgive those who wrongfully accused me because divine forgiveness serves healing purposes that revenge cannot provide, and I thank Judge Harrison for choosing courage over career safety when divine intervention required human partnership for exposing truth. Judge Harrison, whose physical and spiritual healing had been completed through Maya's supernatural intervention, felt profound satisfaction that accompanied recognition of divine purposes served through personal sacrifice that had exposed corruption while protecting innocent families from systematic prosecutorial misconduct. Your Honor, he said, rising to address the court that had witnessed systematic reform beginning with one 16-year-old girl's impossible offer, what this investigation has revealed is that divine intervention can serve legal purposes when human courage chooses supernatural authority over institutional protection that serves corruption. Maya Rodriguez's healing abilities provided not only physical restoration of my mobility, but spiritual restoration of my faith in justice that serves truth rather than wealth through systematic reform that protects community welfare. The corruption we've exposed represents institutional failure that required divine intervention, because human institutions refused to investigate prosecutorial misconduct that destroyed innocent families while enriching criminal enterprises. What we've learned is that supernatural justice enhances rather than threatens legal institutions when those institutions choose truth over corruption, community welfare over personal advancement, divine authority over human protection that serves wealth rather than justice. Maya stood to address the court that had been transformed through divine intervention serving justice purposes, understanding that her supernatural gifts had been provided for systematic reform rather than just individual healing, community welfare rather than just family protection. Your Honor, she said with authority that reflected spiritual maturity beyond her 16 years, divine intervention that began with healing Judge Harrison's paralysis was designed to heal institutional paralysis that prevented legal systems from serving justice rather than corruption. What supernatural healing reveals is that divine authority can serve human institutions when those institutions choose spiritual guidance over institutional protection that maintains corruption while destroying innocent families. Judge Harrison's courage to investigate divine revelation despite professional risks created systematic change that serves community welfare through individual sacrifice guided by supernatural wisdom. Divine justice doesn't replace human responsibility but enhances human capacity for serving truth when institutional responsibility serves corruption rather than community welfare or individual justice. As the court concluded proceedings that had resulted in 312 wrongful convictions being overturned, 47 corrupt officials being sentenced to federal prison, and systematic reforms being implemented throughout prosecutorial offices that now prioritize truth over conviction statistics, Maya understood that her desperate love for her father had created divine intervention serving purposes beyond individual family welfare. Maya, Judge Harrison said as they left the courthouse where divine justice had triumphed over institutional corruption through supernatural intervention guided by human courage, what you accomplished through divine healing was community healing that serves justice purposes beyond what either of us imagined possible. Judge Harrison, what we accomplished together proves that divine partnership with human courage can create systematic change when individual healing serves community welfare through supernatural intervention. Maya, what our partnership demonstrates is that spiritual authority enhances rather than threatens legal authority when both serve justice purposes that protect innocent families while exposing corruption. Judge Harrison, what our spiritual connection reveals is that divine intervention can serve institutional reform when human institutions choose supernatural guidance over professional protection that maintains corruption. The Harrison Rodriguez Institute for Divine Justice had been established to train legal professionals in recognizing supernatural intervention serving justice purposes, providing resources for investigating prosecutorial corruption, and supporting families affected by wrongful conviction through systematic misconduct that legal institutions had previously refused to acknowledge. Miguel Rodriguez had become Director of Victim Advocacy Services, using his experience with wrongful prosecution to help other families navigate legal systems that now prioritize truth over conviction statistics through reforms inspired by divine intervention serving community welfare. Judge Harrison, whose judicial career had been transformed rather than destroyed through courage that exposed corruption, now served as Chief Justice for the state's newly created Divine Justice Review Board, which investigated cases where supernatural intervention might reveal truth that normal legal procedures failed to discover. Maya continued developing her healing abilities through spiritual guidance that revealed divine gifts serving community welfare rather than just individual restoration, helping other families experience miraculous intervention when legal institutions proved inadequate for circumstances requiring supernatural assistance. Judge Harrison, Maya said as they dedicated the Institute's new courthouse chapel where legal professionals could seek divine guidance for serving justice rather than institutional advancement, what we've learned is that supernatural intervention doesn't replace human responsibility but provides spiritual resources for serving truth when human resources prove inadequate. Maya, what divine justice teaches is that spiritual authority and legal authority enhance each other when both serve community welfare rather than competing for control over circumstances that require collaborative approach to systematic reform. Judge Harrison, what our partnership proves is that divine intervention can create institutional change through individual courage when people choose supernatural authority over professional protection that serves corruption. Maya, what our spiritual connection demonstrates is that miraculous healing can serve justice purposes when healing includes both physical restoration and spiritual transformation that guides legal decisions toward truth rather than wealth. As they prepared to help other families experience divine intervention serving justice purposes, while legal institutions learned to recognize supernatural authority enhancing rather than threatening human authority, both understood that Maya's desperate offer to heal paralyzed legs had created systematic healing that protected innocent families while proving that divine justice could indeed serve community welfare through human partnership guided by spiritual wisdom. The miracle had been completed, not just physical healing that restored mobility, but institutional healing that restored faith in justice serving truth rather than corruption, community healing that protected innocent families while exposing criminal enterprise, spiritual healing that proved divine intervention could serve systematic reform when human courage chose supernatural authority over professional protection. Maya's supernatural gifts had transformed desperate family crisis into community blessing that served divine purposes through human cooperation, proving that miraculous intervention could indeed serve justice when people chose courage over safety, truth over corruption, community welfare over individual advancement that required destroying other families for personal benefit. It was more than enough. It was everything divine justice could accomplish when guided by love rather than revenge, when serving community welfare rather than just individual protection, when proving that supernatural intervention could enhance rather than threaten human institutions through systematic reform that honored both spiritual authority and legal responsibility for creating justice that served truth rather than wealth, mercy rather than corruption, divine purposes rather than institutional protection that maintained systematic misconduct affecting innocent families throughout communities where legal institutions had forgotten that justice required divine guidance alongside human wisdom.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.